Good morning, everyone. Firstly, thank you very much for joining our GDPR WebEx today with Forcepoint. Today we're going to be talking about data identification and control. My name's Adam Louca, and I'm a Chief Technologist here for security here at Softcat. I'm joined today by Chris Jones of Forcepoint, who is a sales engineer today. So what we thought we'd just start off with is just a quick overview of Softcat's methodology towards GDPR and how we're going around helping customers deal with the sort of GDPR changes that are coming out. We'll quickly then just drop into a little bit about some of the services offerings we have that are available here at Softcat that potentially might be of interest. And then I'm going to hand over to Chris to take you through how Forcepoint are addressing the GDPR changes, how their product can be used to both identify and control data. So, firstly, GDPR ultimately is a data problem. I'm sure many of you will be well aware of that, and actually the changes that have come in have forced organizations to really have a much better understanding of how they're using data, how they're processing it, and ultimately how they're securing that data. What we've done is we've broken our GDPR strategy down into sort of four main key elements that you can see on the screen there. So, number one, assessment. So, services that enable you to understand actually how the data is moving through your organization, what policies and procedures you have in place, help you build out an understanding of your security control model, and then help you start to remediate some of those issues. The second part is obviously security. The security of data is massively important and is key to your GDPR strategy. So ensuring that not only are you processing data appropriately and that you have all the legal requirements in place to control and use that data, but making sure that actually you're putting the adequate controls in place to stop any data leakage or potential breach. The next part is actually managing that data. So GDPR is not only just about protecting the data, but it's also about using it properly. So managing the life cycle of the data, actually understanding where data is sitting, and ensuring that you're removing that data when you no longer have a right to use it anymore. And then finally, it's a process analysis, so understanding how the data is moving through your organization, through different parts of the business, both internally and externally. So just to talk a little bit about some of the service offerings we have, some of you may be aware of these, but it's always worth reiterating. So we've broken it down into these four stages, so understand, define, implement, and manage. So for anyone still at that initial stages of investigating what they're going to do to sort GDPR out, our Fast Start service is a great way of taking a small bit of initial consultancy that will help you understand where you are, understand what GDPR is, and understand how ready you are to take on that challenge. Once you've done that piece, we can come and help you actually define what your GDPR scope and design should look like. So actually, how do you build privacy into that process? How do you create the right registers you need, and how do you make sure the policy frameworks are in place? Then we can help you implement those compliance requirements and help you implement new solutions. And then finally, an ongoing management of that. So if you have a requirement to have a data protection officer, we even offer a DPO as a service. And again, we can work with an ongoing annual contract to help you continually improve your GDPR stance. So Chris, I assume you're there?
Hi, yes I am.
How are you doing this morning, Chris?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you.
Excellent. So I'm now going to hand over to Chris. And Chris, I guess it'd be really good for you to give us an introduction and about what you do at Forcepoint and sort of how Forcepoint ties into GDPR.
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. So yeah, as you know, I'm Chris Jones. I'm one of the sales engineers at Forcepoint. This will probably factor into a bit of my presentation, but I've been within Forcepoint for nearly coming up for 14 years now. So I've seen a lot of change in terms of how our technology performs and everything along those lines. And that's what I want to talk through a bit about today, how technology's evolved, how that really ties into GDPR and what we're going to do. Now within Forcepoint, we've got quite a few bits of technology that align against parts of the GDPR regulations. But I do want to point out that it's not a kind of a one-size-fits-all. It's not a silver bullet that's just going to press a button and solve GDPR. Because as you will all well know, there's a lot of moving parts within GDPR that need to be covered. So, as I said, I've been here a very long time, and I've seen huge amounts of change in how I speak to organisations and how organisations are built. Going back right when I started, companies of whatever size they happen to be, they may have had a few office locations, but they probably didn't have people who were necessarily all over the world and constantly changing their location. working from home happened, but was certainly a much rarer scenario than it is now, when it seems to be almost everybody. So people have expanded their locations and where they are. What I've also found out is that data and the way that is used has changed dramatically. Now again, it was at one point in time reasonably siloed within an organisation. It would be within potentially particular data centres, or it would be within particular office locations, but certainly wouldn't be spread out everywhere. Whereas now we have scenarios where, again, it's spread across multiple offices. It's on those people's laptops and desktops when they're out and about and roaming and working from locations. And then, of course, we've got the huge change of cloud infrastructure that's really kicked off in the last few years or so. So now most companies will have a reasonable percentage of their data, what is effectively within somebody else's infrastructure with somebody else's controls. So it all ties together in terms of how an organisation has changed and how people interact with information. The first thing I did within our organisation was looking at email security. And at the time, I think it was on my third or fourth day, very, very early on, we introduced a feature that was called content control. As well as kind of things like lexical rules and standard pieces, it did have the ability to look at things like keywords and credit card data and things like that. And it was the first step that I saw towards data leakage prevention, albeit at a fairly basic level and done only on one particular channel. And it was very interesting in terms of the conversations I was having with people then, because it was an issue at that particular point, and I was finding that people were interacting with data in the same sorts of ways that they are now. Now, of course, things have evolved. They've kicked off a lot more in terms of the way that people can interact with data and what they can share it with, but there were still the same sorts of reasons why people were doing that. Now, of course, technology's moved on a lot since those days, but there's users' behaviours and the reasons why they would share data, that hasn't really changed so much. And one thing I think is worth considering when you're talking about GDPR is almost thinking about it as just initially as a bit about just general data loss and why that information may leave an organisation in the first place. Appreciate that's not the only reason why you need to do GDPR, but certainly from our side, it's something that we're able to help with. And I would say that the reasons why information might leave an organisation kind of always broke down to the user level. It's always about the humans that are involved in it. It breaks down to three main areas: accidental insiders, compromised, or malicious ones. Now, the accidental ones, these are ones you're probably most familiar with, and oftentimes this is because someone's actually trying to do their job or doesn't realise that what they're doing is a bad thing. Maybe there's a piece of technology in the way of how they feel that they should be doing their job. Now, the issue is, of course, a lot of those things are there for very good reasons. And just because someone thinks that's the right thing to do doesn't mean that it actually is. Compromised insiders are the ones that we hear about quite a lot. These are the ones that, frankly, are going to make the news. Because if an organisation gets hacked, credentials get stolen, you get infected with a piece of malware, as well as the fact that there's often multiple companies that get hit with the same sorts of thing, it's an interesting story. So we see quite a lot of these ones. And malicious insiders, again, are an interesting one, and ones we do hear about, because when somebody's actually gone rogue and when someone's actually actively trying to steal things, there's a story there. And in my career, I have actually worked with organisations that have had what is effectively literal spies working within their organisations, actively trying to steal data, as well, of course, ones that are not nearly quite sophisticated and are people who are leaving organisations and just trying to take a bit of information with them as they go. There's a big spectrum of reasons why data is going to leave your organisation. And what's interesting is when you think about the technologies that you might look for to solve things like data loss, and particularly GDPR, because certain technologies are aimed at certain areas and they will perform better within certain types of users. So some things are going to be much better at protecting you against compromised insiders than they will against accidental breaches or malicious breaches, for example. So looking at certain types of research on this, what we find actually is that the vast majority of breaches are accidental insiders. This probably isn't much of a shock to you. It should be something you understand, but it sometimes can help to see that put in front of you, because it starts to put some perspective on what you're actually looking for and what the controls need to be and where you're going to get best investment from. Similarly, if we take compromised insiders, the ones that get all the headlines and the ones that very senior people are going to have heard of and are going to be concerned about, it's actually only 10% of the breaches. I'm not suggesting that we don't cover for them, we don't protect against them, but they certainly are in the minority. Which leaves 22% of those breaches to be against your malicious insiders. Definitely a step up from the compromised insiders, but even those two together isn't even a drop in the ocean compared to those accidental breaches. So, focusing a bit more on GDPR, it's something that in one shape or form I've been talking on and off about for 2-3 years now. It's been a big part of my day job for a very, very long time, is all I can remember. There's a lot of stages that people would need to take involved. So we've been talking to people about preparation for quite a long time. Key thing I think with preparation is all about data discovery, which is part of what I want to talk about today. I think if you understand where your data is in the first place, it gives you a much better idea of how that data might move, how people have used it in the past, and how things are being interacted with. Now, we're within this 12-month stage that's in the middle in terms of reviewing mapping. Some people have done some sort of process against this. Most people, in my experience, haven't done that yet. It really depends on who you are as an organization. One thing I would say, if you're looking at any sort of data loss prevention or data mapping technology, is that this process is absolutely critical. I talk about it as with the Forcepoint name of the product, which is data loss prevention. However, I find it works better to think of it as more of a data usage education tool or a data visibility tool, because that's what you're going to use it for quite a lot of the time. Understanding how people work with data, where that data goes, what people are doing with it. Absolutely, we can move on to stopping it from doing certain behaviours if we want to, but that's potentially an end game, and a lot of organisations I work with don't ever reach that point because they don't need to. Understanding the behaviour and educating the users is actually more than sufficient. And then, of course, we've got the final part, which is the 25th of May next year, when all of this comes into effect, and we have to have all of those notification readiness programs in place. And that's what I want to lead towards in the rest of this presentation. So we have a number of technologies that can assist with GDPR, and there is a lot of other technologies that exist out there that can assist with GDPR as well. We're certainly not the only thing that's going to be out there for it. Working in conjunction with a number of other organisations, we helped fund a research paper with Osman Research, and one of the things that they did was look at the sorts of technologies that people were going to be investing in to assist with GDPR. And it probably shouldn't come as much as a surprise, but DLP was the top technology that people are looking for. That's what we're going to talk about today. So, with all that in mind, hopefully it should be something that's of interest and high on your minds. So what can DLP do? There's 3 areas of GDPR that we believe that we can assist with. Firstly, this is the concept of inventorying your personal data. Now, it doesn't really matter where that data is. It could be on endpoints, it could be on laptops, it could be within databases, it could be within cloud environments, or things like Office 365. We want to be able to treat any of those environments as part of your network, potentially disconnected from your network, but all of your information all the same. The second stage is mapping, managing, controlling those data flows. It's all policy-based, so you can define exactly what you need to do as we'll go through. But it's again, pretty key part, and it shouldn't make a difference where those locations are, whether they're on endpoints, whether they're within your network, or whether they're within cloud environments. We still want to be able to understand what is happening with that data, which then, of course, leads into the final part. We've seen something happen, we know where it's going, and actually that constitutes a breach. So how can we respond to that? What tools do we have that can help us understand why that breach happened, a bit more education, and what we can do to respond about that. So if I start going into a little bit more detail in each of those areas, I'll go with inventory and personal data first. As I said, in terms of the stages of where you go, this would be the one that would make the most sense to start with. And so I believe these slides will be available for you afterwards. So what I've done is I've taken the sections of the GDPR regulatory document that are relevant for us and made them available for here. I'm absolutely not going to read through those, but it means that you know which parts that we're talking about. So with data discovery, as I've already said, the data is everywhere. And what we want to be able to do is make sure that no matter where that information actually is, that we effectively treat it as part of your network, because it is your data. And it doesn't necessarily matter whether that is off of your core network on an endpoint or potentially within a cloud environment. The data still belongs to you, you're still responsible for it, so we still want to be able to discover that that data is there. In terms of what we can actually find, now of course looking at the products can give a better view of this, but there's quite a few things that we can do. Now of course we can describe what data actually looks like, and this can be perfect for anything like a regulatory compliance piece, because we know what personal identifiable information looks like, and that can be across any of the regions across the world, and specifically in this case within the EU. We're going to recognise that information, so we've got somewhere over 2,000 predefined compliance templates. You can use registration wizards to easily click through and find those. I've actually counted it, by the way, from the point that you've logged into the environment to having GDPR policies in place is actually only 9 mouse clicks. So it's really straightforward to do that. We can also learn data as well, and I think this is pretty critical, because it's all well and good for us to say we can identify personally identifiable information from a compliance template, but what if you want to identify your personal identifiable information? Maybe you want to treat the information that's in your CRM system, your customers, your employees. Maybe you want to treat that differently than potentially generic personally identifiable information. And there's a lot of reasons why I've seen people actually do this. And that's where our fingerprinting capabilities really come into play, because we can be pointed at a database, at a file, at a piece of information that you want us to recognize, and we then will know exactly what that looks like and can treat it accordingly. Now within all of these, it doesn't matter if the data is structured or unstructured data. We have the ability to recognize either. Now we may treat them differently. Certainly within structured information, there's much more of a kind of a feel of columns and charts and things where we can say, actually, this particular information is where we want to focus on. You know, if it's our CRM system, we are really interested in the address, name, phone number, and email address fields, but we're not interested in the fields that refer to things like they've opted out of marketing, for example. So you can be a bit more choosy, whereas unstructured information is, by its definition, going to have to be a little bit looser. The other thing, of course, is you may have already been through some form of classification exercise. Now, I do want to hasten to add, classification isn't essential to a good DLP or discovery project. If you've done it, fantastic, because we can absolutely piggyback on that. We can read and discover file tags if they exist. We can also scan and find that information without any sort of tagging for the most part. And what's kind of interesting is, having been through this quite a few times, sometimes people have been through classification exercises and we will see things that have been mistagged and misclassified, potentially because of direct end user intervention. So sometimes having something else as a secondary checker on that can be quite useful. I mentioned predefined policies. This is a really quick and easy way of getting yourself up and running within, I don't want to say minutes, but very, very quickly. Once the product itself is installed, as I said, it's actually only 9 mouse clicks to get GDPR in place, and then actively looking and discovering and seeing what is going on. Once the discovery task has run, the main thing that you need is a decent amount of actionable intelligence, and that's what we're going to filter back for you. A lot of results will tell you exactly where the data is, who can actually access that data, when it's created, who owns it, has it been modified, has it been used recently. And these things can be very, very useful, because if you find some information in a place where it really shouldn't be, and then you also see that absolutely everybody has got file permissions on there, that's far more critical for you to deal with and something that is in a place where it shouldn't be, but that nobody has permission to access. Same as if the location of that is potentially within cloud environments. There's I see a lot of use cases where we find data in places like that, and it really shouldn't be there because it doesn't have the same levels of security potentially as an internal place. Or the cloud organizations don't have the same sorts of compliance, don't have the same geographic restrictions that you might be having to adhere to. So the next stage, monitoring, managing, controlling those data flows. So we know where the data is, and that gives us the ability to maybe remove that data, maybe run classifications, or run any sort of script that we want to. The next stage is, okay, what can people do with that type of data? So again, the particular parts of the GDPR regulations, I've put these in here as well for your reference. And as a moment ago, I was talking about things like the structured and the unstructured data, the predefined compliance versus the ability to fingerprint, or file tagging versus the ability for us to actually go out and find it. All of those classifications are available across our entire product range. So I've discussed them as a part of discovery, but if you've already classified your data, if we already know we're looking for GDPR information, or you've already fingerprinted a CRM system, then all of those dictionaries and scripts and classifications are available for data loss and actually monitoring data flows as well. In terms of where we can look, a good place to start is thinking about is, okay, well, what have we got within our network? Where would we potentially want to look? I see quite a few people thinking, okay, well, web and email, two very obvious places, because those are where our users are interacting with the most. We also see quite a lot of usage around things like the active sync protocol, however, because people have got their email synchronized with their mobile phones. Maybe it's a corporate phone, maybe it's a bring your own device scenario, but if there's sensitive information in their email, they could theoretically save that to their phone or screen print or do anything along those lines. So monitoring your active sync protocol so that it can't go to a phone in the first place means that those devices, which are pretty insecure at the best of times, are in a much better place. The fastest growing area that we see in terms of data loss and monitoring these data flows is our endpoint clients. Far and away, that's the one that people seem to go for first and foremost. And it's because it's reasonably straightforward to cover your entire organization and to cover all of the channels. Again, email and web are actually part of the endpoint, but it also starts to bring in other things like external media sources. I've lost count of the amount of companies that I've spoken to that their USB control to stop information going over USBs is to just block the use of USB drives. I've seen some very interesting things done with that in the past, and inevitably it causes pain, it causes problems and business issues, as people do need to share some data over USB. It makes much more sense to say you can use your USB drive, but this type of information, GDPR data, something else, can't be shared on it. Or if it is, it's encrypted, or it's monitored, or some other action is taken on that. And the final thing we're talking about is cloud environments, because again, people are suddenly using so many more cloud environments. I can't remember the last time I spoke to an organization that wasn't using Office 365 in some sort of way, whether that's discovering the data, whether that's monitoring what can be uploaded or downloaded to it, or changes to files that are actually within those. All make sense for those sorts of things that you want to be able to do. I find probably the best way to start to think about data loss is almost this, from the policy perspective of who, what, where, how, and what do we actually want to do with it at the end. It doesn't take too much for you to sit and say, okay, well, if we are in this department accessing this type of data, could I put it in this location? Should I be able to do those sorts of things? And what you'll find is that the vast majority of cases, if I take personal data as a pretty obvious example, most people shouldn't be able to share that outside of an organization. But there's inevitably going to be potentially certain people, maybe the very, very senior executives, maybe somebody from a marketing team in a very extreme example, that does need to share that information, and maybe they only need to share it with very, very specific sources. If you start to understand those use cases, it starts to help you flesh out and build your policies. And this is why thinking it as data visibility and a data education tool first and foremost is really key, because if you monitor users' activity for a while, you start to see where information is going and what might be legitimate. If data is constantly going to a location, there's probably a good reason for that. Maybe even using things like the confirm option with users on sensitive data. You can share this information, but you have to tell us why you're doing it. There's a pop-up that would come up to do that. If people are refusing to enter information in there, they probably shouldn't be sharing that sort of data. If they're giving legitimate reasons, it helps you audit and therefore change your policy before you get into anything more extreme like the block option potentially. Frankly, all options are on the table and they should all be considered by you, but that bedding in process and that time makes a lot of sense. Now, as with discovery, you get very detailed visibility in terms of what is going on from an incident level, so we can see who was doing something, both from a time and IP address, but also from linking with Active Directory. What was the actual channel that was going up? Was it web? Was it email? Was it endpoint? Was it USB drives? Was it a cloud application? Was it something like a print screen capability? People can try and be quite clever if they're print screening sensitive data to turn it into an image. That's interesting in and of itself. Never mind the fact that we can do optical character recognition, we pick it up anyway, but it's still something that becomes interesting. As you're going to imagine with this sort of technology, because we're theoretically dealing with very, very sensitive information, you can be very specific in terms of what the administrator can see and what they can actually do with it in terms of the further workflow within that. The view that you've got on the screen at the moment is for someone who's got super user permission and can therefore see anything, including, of course, this email version that's on here. They can actually see a copy of the attachment that was on there. Talk quite a bit about cloud at the moment, and this is not necessarily a feature of our DLP solution, but even things like our web solutions can tell you what cloud applications you're using and what the risk associated with those is. So even if you're not necessarily going to be going down a full DLP route, sometimes understanding the cloud applications that people are using, the amount of data that is going back and forth within that, can help you think, okay, well, maybe we do need to justify this, maybe we do need to move into that point. We do, of course, have a full CASB solution as well, which, as of about a month's time, has a full integration with our DLP solution. That would mean if you had a DLP set of policies or DLP fingerprints or capabilities, that the CASB service would be able to link in with that and give you even further integration with those cloud applications and what data can be shared and used within there and where that can go. So the final part that I wanted to talk about was a data breach has happened. What tools are available to help you understand that, to monitor a bit closer and actually report back. So, as with the previous two sessions, is the text that we're referring to and where we believe we're hopefully being relevant. And there's quite a few things that we have capable of doing it. Within our DLP solution, one of the things that we offer is risk-based analytics. So rather than you necessarily needing to view and action and see and understand every single incident, using artificial intelligence, our tool can go through the incidents that have happened, highlight ones that it thinks are the biggest risk for you, and make that visible for you. So who's actually done something? What's their history look like? How have they actually done more than one thing in a day? One person who's done something very, very minor, absolutely, it's a breach and needs investigating, but does it need investigating ahead of someone who's leaked potentially hundreds and thousands of documents and they'd be doing it over a longer period of time or over more incidents? Thinking of like risk analytics, some organisations we find don't necessarily want to go full into the DLP piece, or maybe want to have a secondary area for that, And that's where things like our insider threat technology can come into play. Again, endpoint based, but rather than looking at the data users interacting with, this looks at user behavior, and it will compare user behavior with what they're doing now versus what they were doing yesterday versus what their peer group are doing versus what their organization's doing. If they're generally doing the same sorts of things or generally doing safe things, that's fine. Maybe the moment they start to do things that are out of the ordinary for them or out of the ordinary for their peer group, or do things that actually breach specific sorts of policies, then the insider threat can start to increase their risk score. It can also do things like screen capturing. And again, this is triggered by particular events. So it's not just a constant grab of their screen and the invasion of their privacy. This is something where something interesting has happened. We think this is worth recording for posterity, or more particularly, this is worth recording for context. Because if we understand the context of what a user was doing when they were leaking data or doing something that's led to the leak of data, we're in a better position to understand whether their behavior was good, bad, neutral, or maybe even nothing to do with them.
Chris, I guess one of it might be interesting to hear from your experience working with different customers, how has HR or some of the other departments responded to this sort of screen capturing, and have you had any issues around that really?
Yeah, that's a good question, because absolutely, the moment you start talking about screen capturing and everything, people, the first two words that into people's minds is Big Brother, and certainly on the face of it, it can feel like that. Where this becomes useful is it's not invading privacy in the classic sense, because this isn't somebody actively staring over someone's shoulder or looking at everything they're doing. What we have here is a bunch of machine-driven analytics that is building this decision, and it's only recording the screen. It's only making this information available when there's actually a need and a reason to, and therefore the businesses are protecting themselves. As I said, it's not just a case of recording absolutely everything and making it visible, because that would be an invasion of privacy, and it's not user-driven. So it's not like somebody can have a grudge on someone and decide to constantly peek over everything they're doing. As I said, machine-based analytics making those decisions. And
I guess also conversely, I guess if the logs or something seems like maybe something bad's happening on their machine, actually it gives them potentially a chain of evidence to prove that it wasn't them.
Yeah, definitely. What I thought was interesting when this technology became available to me probably a couple of years ago now, when I first saw it, again, my first thought was, okay, well, brilliant, we'll be able to find the bad guys within an organisation. Speaking to the larger organisation, this technology has actually been in play for quite a long time. It's got millions of users actually on it already. What we've found is the vast majority of cases where this has been used in anger have actually been to exonerate users. And there's been some great stories that have come out where someone's appeared to have been doing something bad that could have potentially led to their being dismissed from an organisation or something very serious, and it turned out that the reasons they were doing something were good, or that their machine had been compromised. It was nothing to do with them in the first place. As I said, it's far and away more likely that we see the good uses for this rather than it being used to convict someone. So very interesting piece of technology, and it fits in nicely with DLP, but also other tools and things that you might be using that might have an interest in how a user behaves and what they might be doing. Other parts, as you've already seen, we got the ability to look through historical results, personal data inventories by doing things like discovery capabilities, seeing what they might have been doing historically and how their behaviours have been changing through looking at previous incidents. And then probably a next part you'll be able to do is you've seen a breach happen. Okay, well, how did that happen? What was it? What policy, what data flow changes do we need to potentially make to make sure that that doesn't happen again? Lots of reports available to help you do this. And as I said, I think things like the incident risk ranking, those analytics based, are a really good place to start, because you might see potentially lots and lots of incidents happening within a certain time. Certainly when you put this in place and start just monitoring, you're going to see a lot of incidents. Starting with the riskiest ones allows you to really understand where are the biggest holes in your organisation, where you really need to shore up your defences and change things.
Chris, I think the interesting thing as well is, I guess, when this will actually potentially highlight any process issues as well. So actually, if there's a problem with maybe a business process, actually, you know, the example I always think of is maybe it's a spreadsheet that's exported that's got hidden columns. The people don't actually realise that there's extra data there. Because this is looking at that data, it would still surface that as a risk. And actually, it might not be anything to do with someone actually trying to maliciously steal data, or, you know, actually it might be a problem with a business process.
Absolutely, definitely. It's going to pick up all of those sorts of things because it's got a very, very different view, and things like that incident risk ranking. I don't know how well you can make out the text, but most of the things as the subject lines there say suspected data theft. One of the other things it will do is highlight broken business practices, because it will be able to see things happening a lot more. But yeah, things like the hidden columns in Excel spreadsheets, or metadata that's tagged within pieces. You know, we do see situations where people have had photos and images that have actually got personal identifiable data attached in the metadata. We're able to pick up those things that somebody else might not necessarily understand, highlight that information so you can actually resolve an issue before it becomes a real issue for you. Yeah, I think it's quite, I've got ever so slightly ahead of myself within those slides there. But as you can see, it's all about understanding what the data is you're actually looking at, and then what you want to do with it. As I said, I just don't think of this as necessarily a data loss tool. I think about making visibility and giving you education on what that data is and how it's used. But if you can see everything black and white in an instant, you know, who's accessing it, what policies it's breaching, what channels it's going out, you know, even then being able to see a copy of that file, you get so much more knowledge than just some bad data has leaked out. You don't necessarily know how. You know, having a full-on workflow to be able to work around that, encrypt it, anonymize data, run different scripts, all that then gives you the ability to adapt as you move on.
For me, I think, not to labour that point, but that's probably one of the most powerful parts of this solution. I think there's a lot of technologies out there on the market that are very good at, you know, looking for data. You know, you're not alone in that marketplace, the ability to detect data. But what seems to be so powerful with the Forcepoint-based solution is, you know, within the console, your ability to very quickly take a remediation action and immediately make an action on that, and/or hand that off to someone. So if you are in a larger team, you know, you could potentially escalate or move that task to someone else.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're not wrong in saying that there's a lot of organisations out there that are very big in the data discovery market. And I suppose if I go on that point from a Forcepoint perspective, I think what helps set us apart is our ability to understand data in a very, very specific way. That fingerprinting capability that I mentioned earlier on, where we can really get our hands on any type of data, be it structured or unstructured, and recognise that really helps us with our capacity to learn. But also the fact that we've done that for discovery, it's actually just as a case of then switching up a gear, and then we've got the ability to have those same things as policies for our data loss and our data visibility piece. Where something that focuses much more on discovery would be, you know, potentially a whole separate product to link those two things together. It does make a difference for me. I've seen so many situations with customers' data as a project does have the potential to be, you know, quite involving. So if anything that cuts out a few extra steps for you, simplifies it, and, you know, maybe that's having the same classifiers within the system, being able to reuse things and just being able to, you know, tick a few more boxes within a policy to cover a few more actions. You know, maybe it's using things like the incident risk ranking to help you understand what incidents are actually happening. I think anything that you can do as an organisation that simplifies a data project will make it that much more successful. Yeah, you know, as we've been talking about, once you've got an incident in place, knowing what you can actually do with it afterwards, what those actions can be, is pretty key. You're going to see quite a few instances whereby, certainly to start with, where you want to ignore them, where you want to close that incident or remove it or just escalate it to someone. Real key to actually do those sorts of things. And also, if you're doing things like data discovery, you maybe want to do some sort of remediation, the ability to run scripts on that, you know, removing data, pseudo-anonymizing data, actually just deleting that file from that location, maybe leaving a stub running a classification tool, real key things to be able to do. And it's probably a better view of what I was talking about earlier with the insider threat capabilities. Having it risk-based, having a nice dashboard that you can say, okay, well, as of today, who are our riskiest users? Because there's a lot of things that happen within the organization, and with the best of intentions, no one has time to address absolutely everything. And most things, frankly, will be pretty minor. If you can have a tool that says, actually, these are the people that you need to focus on, these are the things, because something risky has happened, either because the user's done something bad's happened to the user, or a business process has made something look much, much worse than it is. Again, things like that screen capture, adding context to it, being able to understand exactly why things are happening, really critical for this. So final pieces really, certainly from my side of things before we move on to any sort of questions. There's a lot of advice that we can actually give you in terms of GDPR. I'm not going to read through everything that's on the slide because I appreciate you can all see it and probably read it to yourselves quicker than I can read it through. But it's worth looking at a number of different sources in terms of GDPR advice and really seeing how people are doing it. We've certainly got a lot of people within our organisation because I've done a lot of work with GDPR, myself included, unfortunately for me. But you know, engaging the experts is a real good way to help you get ahead in that. In terms of the information specifically from Forcepoint, we have a whole page dedicated to GDPR, so forcepoint.com/GDPR. There's a number of white papers, regulatory compliance pieces, things like the Hunting and Williams document. Highly recommend that. That's been put together with a third-party law firm to talk really about what the impact of GDPR is and what those technologies can be. So that's a really good read if you're wanting to understand a little bit more. We've also got links to demos of our products and a bit more in-depth analysis. I appreciate today's been a fairly quick run through of what we do.
Perfect. So we're now going to open out to any questions. So if you see in your WebEx client, you've got a Q&A button. You can submit questions via the Q&A button, and they should pop up centrally, and we'll be able to answer them. I guess while people are maybe considering some questions or writing them up, I just want to maybe finish with actually, Forcepoint is a really interesting vendor, I think. I think a lot of people have jumped on the GDPR bandwagon and actually, you know, and try to retrofit a GDPR strategy to their solution. Whereas actually Forcepoint's always been about a data control company. You know, they've always been about actually controlling access from data flowing in and out of the network, you know, from identifying that. And actually they're not trying to sort of retrofit anything. This is really what they were designed to do. So, you know, massively important piece of technology. I think if you're still looking there at the sort of early start of your GDPR or sort of journey, and or you're kind of thinking, actually now I need to start doing something, identification of your data is really a great place to start. So it doesn't look like we're getting any questions coming in currently. Chris, I guess I have a question. Number one, you know, how can people, or what would be your advice to people to sort of start one of these projects? You know, is it getting the agents out there and trying to do that discovery piece? And you know, is there any way Forcepoint can support that in terms of trials?
Yeah, so I think, as I said, discovery is a really good place to start. Once you know where your data is, you probably know how people have been working with it already. Because if you're going to suddenly find a load of information on people's laptops or in their Exchange or in their diaries or wherever it happens to be, if you know that information shouldn't be there, then it gives you much more impetus to say, well, we probably want to be monitoring what people are actually now doing with it. Knowing when that data was copied there, you know, helps you realize whether this is an ongoing problem or something that happened in the past. Discovery, absolutely the place to start. If you can move on to be able to monitor the data mapping side of things, that's a real good secondary stage to do. And as I said, pop something in an audit only. I mean, you asked about what we can do to help, and absolutely we've got the ability to allow customers to use this technology, to see what is going on. And I've run countless proof of concepts of this technology over the years, and way before GDPR was a subject we were talking about, to be honest with you. And it can be quite easy to deploy. When we're putting it in a monitor only mode, we don't necessarily need to think of all the nuances that you might want for a larger scale project. But putting it in that audit mode, maybe integrating it with your mail servers or a web proxy if you've got them. If you're already a Forcepoint customer on a web and email proxies, it's really easy to integrate it with those. But yeah, absolutely unintrusive. It's not going to affect user activity, but it will give you an idea of what is happening, what issues you may have as a company.
Okay, that's really interesting, Chris. And I guess what the final question I think is always worth raising is, obviously you did mention around the cloud access security brokers, the CASBs. How have you sort of seen that cloud environment change the way we've got to deal with data?
Yes, yeah, interesting question. So my background's in the cloud side. As I said right at the start, I initially started here talking about cloud email services. So that's what I've been working on a lot of time. And even back then, people were concerned about the privacy of data in the cloud. Having played around with our CASB tool quite a lot, it's very interesting to see the sorts of cloud applications that people are using. But afterwards, to be able to look at things like the data retention policy that those cloud applications have, or the levels of security they have. Spoken with so many customers that are either ISO 27001 compliant or something similar, or are trying to go for it, and then they've got a load of data, sensitive data stored within organizations that don't have even remotely the same levels of compliance. And that if they were to leave that working with that cloud application, that company's got the ability to retain the data for pretty long periods of time. And that can be quite a shock to customers when they suddenly realise all these things and they just hadn't noticed that. The fact that it's great at highlighting what that small print is for those things and making the useful stuff relevant for them. What I'm really keen to see with CASB though is what we're going to be doing with it in its next iterations. So just about a month, 2 months away. I can't remember the release date for it, but it's very, very soon. It's always been really good at understanding data in cloud applications, so the ability to see, catalog what data you've got in that cloud application, and also understand what's being shared, what's being moved around in and out of that cloud application. Now, if we can integrate it with our full-on DLP solution, and it can start to see things like fingerprints, that I think is what's going to make it really stand out. Because predefined compliance is what it can do at the moment, and that's what a lot of data solutions out there do. Predefined compliance is great for what it is, but you're always going to need to have a split between what is just generic information, which will cause false positives, and understanding what is your specific data, which means you can be treated in a very different way. And I think that's what's exciting for me with CASB at the moment. When that's kicking in and seeing how that changes and how it becomes effectively a part of our DLP tools, and just changes what we do there, that's going to be really good.
Well, thanks very much for your time this morning, Chris. I think that's all the time we've got for questions. So I firstly really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to our customers. Thank you to everyone who's joined the WebEx this morning. It will be available. We've recorded this, and the slides will be available either via your account manager, or if you'd like to email marketing@softcat.com, we'll get those sent out to you. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this morning, and I hope you all have a lovely day. Thank you.